Sir, you are under arrest.
No! You cannot arrest me! I am a doctor!
Yeah.
This dashcam footage from Officer Derek Lewis's patrol car would later become the centerpiece of one of the most damaging civil rights cases in the city's history. But on that particular Thursday evening at 6:47 p.m., it was simply recording what would become the most expensive 23 minutes of an officer's career. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her white BMW, her stethoscope still hanging around her neck from a 12-hour shift in the emergency department at Metropolitan Medical Center. She had just finished treating a patient who had been brought in from a car accident, and she was mentally exhausted in the way only emergency room physicians understand. The fatigue that comes from holding someone's life in your hands, making split-second decisions that determine whether they live or die, leaves you emotionally hollowed out. All she wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. What she didn't expect was to be treated like a criminal in the very parking garage where she had worked for the past 7 years. Officer Derek Lewis had been on the force for 11 years. His personnel file, which would later become crucial evidence in the lawsuit that followed, revealed a troubling pattern that nobody in command had bothered to address seriously. 17 complaints filed against him over those 11 years. 14 of them involved allegations of racial profiling or excessive force during interactions with black citizens. All 14 had been dismissed or resulted in minimal discipline. The system had protected him, enabled him, allowed him to continue operating with the assumption that his badge granted him immunity from accountability. But Officer Lewis didn't know any of this as he approached Dr. Mitchell's vehicle that Thursday evening. What he saw was a black woman in an upscale parking garage, driving an expensive car, leaving a location late in the evening. Something about that combination triggered something in his mind, something dark and prejudicial that he probably didn't even fully recognize in himself. The call that had brought him to this garage in the first place had been vague. A report of suspicious activity in the hospital parking structure. Security had called it in after someone reported seeing a woman matching a vague description near several parked cars. That description could have fit thousands of women in the city. It certainly could have fit Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who was simply walking to her car after completing her shift. Dr. Mitchell, aged 51, had built an impeccable reputation over 2 decades in medicine. She had graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, completed her residency at one of the nation's most prestigious hospitals, and had become board certified in emergency medicine. She had published research papers on trauma care protocols. She had mentored younger physicians, both male and female, showing them how to navigate a profession that could be brutal to women, particularly women of color. She was a divorced mother of 2 children who were currently in college, both of them following their mother's path into medicine. Her colleagues respected her. Her patients trusted her. She had saved lives on more occasions than she could count. But none of that mattered in the moment Officer Lewis approached her vehicle with his hand resting on his service weapon. He demanded her identification. Dr. Mitchell, trained to remain calm in crisis situations, opened her purse and retrieved her driver's license. She also pulled out her hospital identification badge, the one with her photograph and the title Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Emergency Medicine, printed in bold letters. She handed both documents to Officer Lewis, maintaining the kind of professional composure that had served her well in countless emergency situations where panic would have been catastrophic. Officer Lewis studied the documents for longer than necessary. He looked at the photograph on the driver's license, then at Dr. Mitchell's face, then back at the license, as if trying to solve some kind of puzzle. The entire interaction had the feel of someone looking for reasons to find guilt rather than evidence of innocence. When he finally spoke, it was to suggest that the identification might be fraudulent. He claimed that someone matching her description had been involved in a series of vehicle thefts in parking structures across the city. He suggested that she might have stolen the car she was driving. He implied that her credentials might be fake, that she might be an imposter using stolen identification to gain access to hospital facilities. Dr. Mitchell's first instinct was to laugh. The suggestion was so absurd, so disconnected from any reasonable interpretation of reality, that laughter seemed like the only appropriate response. But she had lived long enough in America as a black woman to understand that laughing at a police officer could escalate a situation in ruse and unpredictable ways. So instead, she remained calm. She explained that she was indeed a physician at the hospital, that she had just finished a shift, that the car was registered in her name, and that Officer Lewis was welcome to verify all of this information through the hospital or through a simple check of the vehicle registration. Her reasonableness seemed to anger him. It was as if her refusal to become defensive or emotional was itself evidence of guilt in his mind. He called dispatch and requested that they run her identification through the system. He also requested that they check the vehicle registration and cross-reference it with any outstanding theft reports. Dr. Mitchell stood there in the parking garage, still wearing her scrubs under her jacket, still physically and emotionally exhausted from 12 hours of emergency medicine, while Officer Lewis waited for the information to come back. The dashcam was recording every second of this. The audio was capturing every word. The video was documenting the entire dynamic between a police officer and a citizen who had committed no crime. When the information came back confirming that Dr. Mitchell was exactly who she claimed to be, Officer Lewis didn't immediately apologize or end the encounter. Instead, he suggested that this particular vehicle might be listed under a different registered owner, which would explain why her name appeared in the system, even though she might not actually own it. The logical gymnastics required to maintain his suspicion, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, would have been almost comical if the situation hadn't been so troubling. Dr. Mitchell explained, once again with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining herself in situations where she shouldn't have to, that the car was indeed hers. She provided the purchase date. She mentioned that she had purchased it from an authorized BMW dealership just 8 months earlier. She explained that the registration matched the vehicle identification number on the car standing right in front of them. At this point, a security officer named Marcus Washington, who had been monitoring the parking garage on CCTV, saw the interaction unfolding and came down to the garage to assess the situation. Washington had worked in hospital security for 9 years and knew Dr. Mitchell professionally. He had seen her numerous times entering and leaving the facility. He was familiar with her vehicle. When he arrived at the scene and saw Officer Lewis still questioning Dr. Mitchell, he immediately approached the officer and explained that Dr. Mitchell was indeed a long-time employee of the hospital and that she held a high position in the emergency medicine department. Officer Lewis's response to this additional confirmation was telling. He became defensive. He suggested that Marcus Washington was interfering with a police investigation. He implied that Washington might be complicit in some kind of criminal activity. He warned both Washington and Dr. Mitchell that further obstruction could result in arrests for interfering with law enforcement. The encounter lasted 23 minutes. 23 minutes during which a police officer subjected a black female physician to suspicion, interrogation, and humiliation based on nothing more than her race, and the fact that she was in a location where successful black people apparently weren't supposed to be. The parking garage of a hospital where she had worked for 7 years. The place where she had earned her living, saved lives, and built a career that most people would consider exemplary. When Officer Lewis finally ended the encounter without issuing any citations or making any arrests, he offered a single, dismissive comment. He said that Dr. Mitchell should be more careful about where she parks and that she might want to consider parking in a more appropriate location if she didn't want to attract police attention. The implication was breathtaking in its audacity. She should change her behavior, change her appearance, change something fundamental about herself to avoid being profiled by law enforcement. She should make herself smaller, less threatening, less successful so that officers like Derek Lewis wouldn't feel compelled to harass her. Dr. Mitchell collected her identification from Officer Lewis with trembling hands that she forced to remain steady. She thanked Marcus Washington for his intervention, though gratitude seemed like the wrong emotion for a situation where a hospital security officer had needed to vouch for her humanity to a police officer. She drove home in silence, her mind replaying the encounter over and over, examining it from every angle, trying to determine if there was anything she could have done differently, any way she could have prevented the situation from escalating to that point. But she already knew the answer. There was nothing she could have done differently. The problem wasn't her behavior. The problem was Officer Lewis's prejudice. By the time Dr. Mitchell arrived home, she had made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to let this incident disappear into the background like so many others. She wasn't going to convince herself that it was a simple misunderstanding or an isolated incident. She was going to fight back. She was going to pursue every legal avenue available to her. She was going to use her position, her education, her resources, and her voice to ensure that what happened to her wouldn't happen to someone else who lacked her ability to challenge it. She called her brother, James Mitchell, who was an attorney specializing in civil rights cases. She told him everything, recounting every moment of the encounter with the precision of someone accustomed to providing detailed accounts of medical emergencies. She provided the time, the location, the officer's name, and the basic facts of what had occurred. James listened carefully, asking clarifying questions, and when she finished, he told her something that she both expected and dreaded. He said that what she had described was textbook racial profiling. He said that Officer Lewis had violated her constitutional rights under the Fourth Amendment by conducting a seizure without probable cause or reasonable suspicion. He said that she had a strong case for a federal civil rights lawsuit. And most importantly, he said that he wanted to represent her pro bono, meaning she wouldn't have to pay attorney's fees. He wanted to take the case because it was the right thing to do, and because he knew that cases like hers could influence how courts and police departments addressed racial profiling. James Mitchell immediately began working on the case. He requested the dashcam footage from the incident through official channels. He gathered Dr. Mitchell's employment records from the hospital. He compiled her professional credentials and educational background. He gathered witness statements from other people who worked at the hospital and could attest to Dr. Mitchell's character and position. He began researching Officer Lewis's history with the police department, and what he found was damning. The personnel file showed pattern after pattern of racial profiling. The complaints ranged from traffic stops that led to searches of black drivers to allegations that Officer Lewis had made racist comments during encounters. Multiple people had filed complaints suggesting that Officer Lewis had a pattern of stopping black citizens in upscale neighborhoods and accusing them of being out of place. In almost every case, these stops had resulted in nothing. No arrests, no contraband found, no crimes discovered. The only consistent outcome was that black citizens had been humiliated and subjected to unwarranted police scrutiny. The hospital administration, once informed about what had happened to Dr. Mitchell, was appalled. Not only had one of their most respected physicians been treated disrespectfully, but the implications for the hospital's reputation and the safety of their staff were significant. Hospital administrators understood that if the police were going to profile their employees based on race, then the hospital wasn't providing the safe environment it claimed to offer. The hospital's legal team reached out to James Mitchell and offered to provide institutional support for his case. They authorized him to subpoena all relevant personnel records. They offered hospital security footage and records that might help corroborate the incident. They made statements to the media expressing their full support for Dr. Mitchell and their commitment to addressing the racial profiling incident. Within weeks of the incident, the story began gaining traction in local news outlets. A prominent emergency room physician had been profiled and harassed by police while simply leaving work. The optics were terrible for the police department. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to saving lives, who had earned her position through years of education and hard work, being treated like a criminal based on nothing more than her race and the location where she had parked her car. Civil rights organizations picked up the story and began organizing awareness campaigns. The NAACP released a statement calling attention to the systemic nature of racial profiling in police work. Local activists organized a rally outside police headquarters, where hundreds of community members gathered to demand accountability. The police department's initial response was defensive. They released a statement claiming that Officer Lewis had been responding to a legitimate report of suspicious activity, and that he had followed proper procedures in investigating the incident. They suggested that the encounter had been a simple case of mistaken identity, and that Dr. Mitchell's decision to pursue legal action was an overreaction to a misunderstanding. The statement was made without having reviewed the dashcam footage. When police department officials actually watched the recording, their position changed dramatically. The footage showed exactly what Dr. Mitchell had described. It showed Officer Lewis maintaining suspicion despite overwhelming evidence of her innocence. It showed him becoming increasingly defensive when confronted with proof that his initial assumptions were wrong. It showed him essentially gaslighting Dr. Mitchell by suggesting that her legitimate credentials might be fraudulent simply because she didn't match his expectations for who should be driving an expensive car in a hospital parking garage. The police chief, David Richardson, called an emergency meeting with his command staff. He watched the dashcam footage and listened to legal counsel explain the liability exposure the department was facing. He understood immediately that the initial defensive response had been a mistake. He made the decision to place Officer Lewis on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The internal affairs investigation moved quickly. Investigator Captain Robert Hayes reviewed the dashcam footage, the dispatch records, the witness statements, and Officer Lewis's personnel file. He concluded that Officer Lewis had violated multiple department policies, including those governing traffic stops, investigative detention, and professional conduct. The investigation also revealed that Officer Lewis had not actually received any verified report of vehicle thefts, matching Dr. Mitchell's description. The call that had brought him to the parking garage had been so vague that it could have applied to literally anyone. Captain Hayes's report documented a clear pattern of racial profiling on Officer Lewis's part. The statistics showed that over his 11-year career, Officer Lewis had stopped black citizens at rates significantly higher than white citizens in the same areas. His searches of black citizens had yielded evidence of actual crimes at the same rate as searches of white citizens, proving that his increased scrutiny of black people wasn't based on legitimate law enforcement concerns. The report concluded that Officer Lewis's conduct toward Dr. Mitchell had been inappropriate, unjustified, and indicative of a broader pattern of racial bias in his policing practices. Based on this investigation, Police Chief Richardson made the decision to fire Officer Lewis. The termination was effective immediately. Officer Lewis's 15-year career in law enforcement ended based on the incident with Dr. Mitchell and the pattern of racial profiling documented in his personnel file. The termination made front-page news. Officer Lewis became a nationally recognized symbol of the problem of racial profiling in policing. News organizations picked up the story and reported on it extensively. Civil rights experts appeared on television programs explaining the significance of the case and what it meant for police accountability. Legal scholars wrote articles analyzing how the case highlighted systemic problems in law enforcement. Meanwhile, James Mitchell had filed a federal civil rights lawsuit seeking damages for his sister's violation of rights. The complaint alleged violations of the Fourth Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and multiple federal civil rights statutes. The lawsuit named Officer Lewis as an individual defendant, along with the police department and the city. The discovery process revealed information that made Officer Lewis's situation even worse. Emails and text messages found during discovery showed him making explicitly racist comments about citizens he had stopped, messages where he had joked about profiling black drivers, communications where he had expressed frustration about uppity, black people who didn't show proper respect to authority. These communications provided direct evidence of discriminatory intent that civil rights lawsuits often struggle to prove. They showed that this wasn't just a case of one officer making a mistake. This was a case of an officer who harbored deep racial prejudice and who had used his position of authority to act on that prejudice repeatedly throughout his career. Officer Lewis hired an attorney who advised him to settle the case rather than proceed to trial. The attorney explained that the evidence against him was overwhelming. The dashcam footage alone would be devastating in front of a jury. Combined with the racist communications found during discovery and the documentation of his pattern of racial profiling, there was virtually no realistic scenario in which a jury would rule in his favor. Officer Lewis and his attorney entered into settlement negotiations with James Mitchell and the city's legal team. The initial offers were rejected as inadequate. The city initially offered $100,000, suggesting that it was a reasonable amount for what they characterized as a simple case of mistaken identity. James Mitchell responded with a demand for $2 million. He explained that his sister had suffered significant emotional distress from the incident. She had been publicly humiliated in front of her coworkers and security personnel. Her reputation, though ultimately vindicated, had been temporarily questioned. Her sense of safety in her own workplace had been violated. She had experienced the kind of trauma that comes from being profiled and treated like a criminal despite being innocent. Negotiations continued over several months. The city gradually increased their offer as they understood the strength of Dr. Mitchell's case and the potential damage a jury verdict could cause. The story had captured national attention. Other victims of Officer Lewis's racial profiling had come forward. Some of them had their own attorneys. Class action lawsuits were being organized. The potential exposure for the city was enormous. After nearly 8 months of negotiation, a settlement was reached. The city agreed to pay Dr. Mitchell $950,000 in damages. The settlement also included a comprehensive reform package designed to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. The police department was required to implement implicit bias training for all officers. This wasn't just a one-time training session, but an ongoing program with annual refresher courses and assessment of officer conduct to ensure that the training was being taken seriously and having a genuine impact on behavior. The settlement also required the creation of a civilian oversight board with real power to investigate complaints about officer conduct. This wasn't just an advisory board that could make recommendations that department leadership could ignore. This was a board with genuine authority to compel investigations, subpoena witnesses, and recommend disciplinary action up to and including termination. Additionally, the settlement required statistical monitoring of police stops and searches to identify potential racial bias patterns before they became as entrenched as Officer Lewis's had become. Officers' traffic stop data and search histories would be reviewed quarterly to identify any individual officers or units showing disparities in their enforcement patterns. If disparities were identified, the officers involved would receive retraining and their conduct would be closely monitored. The settlement also required that dashcam and bodycam footage be reviewed more carefully as part of performance evaluations. No longer would supervisors simply accept officers' written reports without actually watching the video of what had occurred. The video evidence would serve as the primary record of what happened during any police encounter, not the officer's subjective written account. Dr. Mitchell decided to donate a portion of her settlement to establish a foundation supporting victims of racial profiling by law enforcement. She named the foundation after her father, who had experienced police harassment during his lifetime and had raised his children to stand up against injustice. The foundation provides legal resources, mental health support, and financial assistance to people who have been victims of racial profiling and don't have the resources to pursue legal action. Officer Lewis found himself unemployable in law enforcement. No police department would hire an officer who had been fired for racial profiling a prominent physician. He struggled to find work in any field. His name had been widely publicized. His background check revealed that he had been terminated for misconduct. Most employers were unwilling to hire someone with his history. He eventually found work as a security guard for a private firm, earning a fraction of what he had made as a police officer. The salary cut was severe, but the psychological impact was arguably worse. He had defined himself as a police officer for his entire adult life. That identity had been stripped away by his own actions. The national media coverage of the case brought it to the attention of federal officials. The Department of Justice announced that it was monitoring the situation and considering whether to launch a broader investigation into the police department's practices. The publicity created pressure on city officials to implement meaningful reforms. The mayor appointed a commission to review all police policies and procedures with an eye toward identifying and eliminating racial bias. The commission included community representatives, civil rights experts, police reform advocates, and city officials. Their mandate was to conduct a comprehensive review and make recommendations for systemic change. The commission's final report, released 1 year after Dr. Mitchell's incident, recommended sweeping reforms to police practices throughout the city. The recommendations went far beyond what had been required in the settlement with Dr. Mitchell. They included requirements for comprehensive implicit bias training for all officers, new protocols for traffic stops designed to minimize the potential for racial profiling, changes to department culture that would emphasize accountability rather than loyalty to fellow officers, and increased transparency through body camera footage and public reporting on police stops and searches broken down by race. The police chief appointed a new position within the department specifically devoted to racial profiling prevention. The officer appointed to this position had the authority to review cases, make recommendations for policy changes, and report directly to the chief about any concerning patterns in officer conduct. Dr. Mitchell returned to the emergency room and continued her work saving lives, but her experience had changed her perspective on police and policing. She began collaborating with the police department on training programs for officers about de-escalation techniques and implicit bias. She spoke publicly about her experience, giving interviews to media outlets, speaking at law schools and police academies, and advocating for reforms. Her willingness to speak publicly about what had happened to her encouraged other victims to come forward with their own stories. The foundation she created provided resources that had previously been unavailable to victims of racial profiling. People who couldn't afford attorneys could now access legal representation. People dealing with the psychological trauma of profiling could access mental health support. The case became a landmark in civil rights jurisprudence, studied in law schools, as an example of how institutional change could be achieved through legal action combined with public pressure and institutional commitment to reform. The dashcam footage from Officer Lewis's patrol car, which had recorded his entire misconduct, was used in training programs nationwide to show police officers and supervisors what racial profiling looks like in practice and what consequences it carries. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrated that sometimes justice requires more than just winning a lawsuit. Justice requires using that victory as a platform for systemic change. It requires taking your vindication and using it to create mechanisms that protect other people from experiencing what you endured. Dr. Sarah Mitchell proved that individuals, when they have the courage to fight back and the resources to pursue legal action, can create ripple effects that transform entire institutions. The incident that had begun as a simple case of racial profiling in a hospital parking garage had evolved into a comprehensive examination of police practices throughout the city. One woman's decision to refuse to be silenced had led to the termination of one officer, the implementation of systemic reforms, the settlement of multiple cases, and the establishment of mechanisms designed to prevent future misconduct. Officer Lewis had thought that his badge protected him from accountability. He had believed that he could profile Dr. Mitchell with impunity. He had assumed that his version of events would be accepted without question. He was catastrophically wrong. The dashcam he had worn that evening had recorded his own misconduct. The system that had protected him for 11 years suddenly turned against him once the public spotlight was shined on his behavior. The institution that had allowed racial profiling to continue unchecked was forced to confront the reality of what had been happening in its ranks. Dr. Mitchell proved that sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to fight through a legal system that isn't always designed to favor the people bringing claims against it. But when people stand up and refuse to accept injustice, when they gather evidence and tell their stories and pursue legal action despite the personal cost, change becomes inevitable. The status quo becomes unsustainable. Institutions are forced to address problems they had previously been willing to ignore. And that's when real transformation becomes possible. That's when what happened to one person becomes a catalyst for systemic change that protects countless others. This case stands as a testament to the power of one person's decision to fight back and the extraordinary impact that courage can create.